the ones we might know of as the creators of the human species, or the ones who manipulated our DNA to create us. So maybe you can expand on that, and we can start tying everything else in through these supposed creators of ours.
Sure. Well, I know a lot of your listeners are probably familiar with the material by now, because I noticed some of your recent guests. And what we're told in a lot of the ancient texts were that there were these beings known as angels or gods that came from the heavenly realms, and they essentially did something. They interacted with the human race. Now, whether or not they actually did any genetic manipulation or anything, that's just speculation, so we're not really sure about that. But at the very least, what the ancient texts do tell us is that they gave humanity and civilization a jump start, so that they passed down knowledge and other information that gave humans power. And unfortunately, some of this knowledge and power wasn't things that we were meant to know at the time, and so a lot of these angels or gods were punished for their deeds, and they were known as the Watchers.
So is there anything to differentiate the Watchers from the Nephilim?
Well, if you go with the more scholarly basis on this, generally they would say that the Nephilim were actually the hybrid offspring, the union between the Watchers, which were angels, and human women.
Yeah.
And speaking about
now,
the Titans and the Giants in the Old Testament. Of
yeah,
the Bible,
yeah, you get the same kind of myths all around the world, whether you're talking about the Titans or. Sure. Now, I do speculate, though, since Nephilim, it does partially have a Hebrew root. If you study the etymology of the word, it can mean fallen ones, but it's also based on an Aramaic root, and Hebrew and Aramaic were very closely related in the ancient world. And
for the listeners out there, could you maybe set some differences or similarities between the Anunnaki and the Nephilim? Are there any differences?
Sure.
Are there any similarities?
Sure, I can get into that. Just to finish up the thought about the Nephilim, like it means fallen ones if you take the Hebrew approach, but if you look at the Aramaic root, it also meant giants. So that's why I try to stick with the scholarly approach that it was referring to the offspring.
What's the exact root word for that?
Nephal.
In the Hebrew? Nephal.
Yeah, in the Hebrew. Now,
and that's Nephal?
Yeah, that would be the transliteration into English.
Okay.
Now, the scholar Michael Heiser has pointed out that there are two spellings of Nephilim in the Old Testament, and one of them has an extra yod letter, which only comes from an Aramaic root. And so whenever you study the Aramaic root, that implies that it meant giant. So that's why we try to stick more with that approach than just saying that they were one and the same as the Watchers or the Fallen Ones. But it could simply be a title that the children inherited from their parents. So there isn't really a whole lot of information about it in the text specifically referring to the Nephilim as a title. So since there isn't a whole lot, I just try to stick with what the scholars know right now.
Yes.
Now, Melchizedek, you had a question about the Anunnaki. As far as in the ancient... Go ahead.
I was just going to say, to clarify for the listeners out there, because we kind of do a show that's in layman's terms, so whenever we talk about something, we'll kind of explain it just a little bit so everybody can understand what we're talking about.
Sure. Now, the Anunnaki, that comes from the ancient Sumerian and Mesopotamian texts. That's what they used to refer to their ancient gods. And the best scholarly definition of that meant princely offspring. Now, if you get into the research of somebody like Zecharia Sitchin, he tries to say that it meant those who from heaven to earth came. But we can get into this later on. I usually don't try to get into the bashing other authors, but Zecharia Sitchin is one that usually does come up since he's so well known regarding this material. And
he has done a lot of research too into the area, and unless somebody lived during that time, it's hard for anybody to say who's right,
Well, yeah, I suppose, but at the same time, his own books prove that he doesn't know the ancient languages that he claims to know. So if you study what the scholars put forth and then compare it, I actually have a section in my book where I'm showing, the very word that Sitchin is talking about that he says isn't in the line that he reproduces in the text is there if you know what you're looking for.
Is that is that the word Anakim?
No, that's actually he was referring to a line of text referring to the Watchers, and he reproduces. I think it's in the book Stairway to Heaven. And he reproduces the line of text because he shows it, and it's in Aramaic, although he refers to it as Hebrew, but it's actually Aramaic if you know the difference. And essentially, he says that the Watchers and the Nephilim are the same, but he says nowhere in this line does it say Watchers. And if you actually look at the line he reproduces in his own book, if you know what the word Watchers looks like in Aramaic, it's right there in the middle of it. So he's trying to reinterpret the words and meanings to suit his belief system and trying to get everyone else to believe that too, where unfortunately if you actually have a little bit more knowledge and look into this stuff and look up the words in the ancient dictionaries and everything, you would be able to see that he's taking things out of context or changing the meanings that it doesn't fit what the ancient text actually said, but it fits perfectly with what he wants them to say.
I hate to interject just for a second, but just to clarify for the listeners out there, the difference between Hebrew and Aramaic, isn't that just a dialect difference?
Essentially, yes. Some of the words did have similar or very similar meanings between the two. Sometimes they did mean different things. But for instance, one of the ways that you can tell the difference is in Hebrew, some of the plural words will end with an I-M, with M like Mary, and so you have the word Elohim. Now, that same word in Aramaic would be Elohim. It ends with an I-N. So that's the difference.
Okay.
All right.
That was some great clarification right there also. Thanks. Yes.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I just want to go on record. I mean, I'm not a Hebrew or Aramaic scholar or anything like that, but I do try to pay attention to the facts and look up the scholarly research. So, I used to be a Sitchin fan. Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you
off.
Okay. I was just going to say that we respect everybody's points of view and stuff here. I dig that about everybody. Everybody has a different one, so...
Yes.
Sure, yeah, and I do too. I mean, I think everyone should have the right to say whatever they want. It's just that if you're going to make certain claims, you should have a way of backing it up, supporting it in some way. And I was one of the ones that whenever I first got on Zecharia Sitchin's material, I thought, wow, this is fascinating and answers so much stuff. But then as I started reading more and actually started looking over the stuff from scholarly sources and getting the ancient dictionaries and looking up the terms for myself, I found that there was a lot of manipulation going on the part of Zecharia Sitchin's material, which makes me not trust the majority of it. I mean, he might have some of the stuff right, but if he's going to manipulate the text, then I don't want to consider that any kind of valid source in my book.
Well, as for Zecharia Sitchin's work, I noticed you're not filming a lot of his stuff. Is there anything that you're actually aligned with? And maybe you can explain those and maybe explain the things that you're not really subscribed to yet.
Well, I don't know. It's hard to say because it's been so many years since I read a lot of his stuff. I mean, I don't have any problem with the idea of the
we have a lot of Sitchinites listening, so of course.
I'm sure.
Not only that, but we kind of stay away from knocking other authors because we know a lot of authors and we know a lot. We respect everybody's ideas and the way their perspectives and stuff. But I got a real interesting question for you later on whenever we get past this point right here and get to the
I just wanted to get off the Sitchin thing, maybe for him to close it off on his perspective on basically what people can look for and what they shouldn't be looking at out of Sitchin's work, basically.
Well, like I said, I don't have any real problem with the idea of the ancient gods being from another planet. It's just whenever you actually go back and look at the ancient text and you compare what Zecharia Sitchin is saying, it doesn't actually match. He feels that he can reinterpret the meanings of a lot of the words, and so the difference I tried to do with mine was go back and look at what the scholars tell us the words mean and try to put that into my current theories and everything and see if they fit. And what I found was that the modern or even the older scholars' translations and understandings of the words fit more in line with my theories than Zecharia Sitchin's, and I think it bridges a whole lot of gaps in what we know about the paranormal and everything. So, again, I'm not trying to bash other authors. I mean, I don't want to come off that way. That's not really, my thing. But I do feel it is a responsibility to other people. I mean, if they're going to get into this, just double check other sources. Don't take any one author's word as the ultimate source. I want everyone feel free to question me, to double check my work if you have questions or problems with it. Research it. If you find something wrong, let me know.
Exactly. Yeah, that's basically the point I wanted to get out, so the listeners can make their own discernment and basically try to figure out what are the truths within Sitchin's work and what are the faults.
Yeah, like I said, it's been several years since I read a lot of it, so I can't really think of any specific points that I can recall, unless you know
perfectly,
some.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. We since it tied, like you mentioned before, it ties so much into his early works. Just to close his whole position off in this conversation, but let's maybe get back into the fallen angels, because I noticed your book contains a lot of work on the fallen angels. So maybe you can explain your perspective of the fallen angels.
Sure. Well, basically, a lot of people think they know the story where we're told about the fall of the angels involved Satan or Lucifer rebelling and bringing down a third of the angels, and essentially just going completely against God's commandments and wreaking havoc on the earth. But that's only partially correct, and actually if you go back and read the biblical text and a lot of the supporting culture view, we find that the original story of the fall of the angels didn't involve a character named Lucifer at all, but it involved the Watchers, which was a group of heavenly angels that basically, while in heaven, they were sent down to basically teach humans about civilization, give them the building blocks of civilization, and to take care of us. And while they were here, they essentially became corrupted. They became enamored with the lovely human women and decided that even though it wasn't their place to do so, they were going to marry and interbreed with the humans. And that was the real rebellion that took place in the ancient world, and that was the original fall of the angels, or the fall of the Watchers, that we get a very brief glimpse of that in Genesis chapter 6, and then it's expanded much further in the book of Enoch.
Well, in your perspective, essentially, in theory too, actually, if the fallen angels or the Watchers were to propagate with the human women, would there still be offspring on the planet today, or would we all be considered offspring? In your perspective, your point of view?
That's a good question. Yeah.
Yeah, that is a very good question. To be perfectly honest, I don't know. I mean, you would think so. However, according to the ancient text, what brought about the deluge was in an attempt to eradicate all of this interbreeding. So whenever you look around the world, you find all sorts of stories about a great flood. Now, whether or not it actually covered every single part of the earth, that's up for debate. But
so in the Hebrew text, that's actually stated as it was a curse, correct?
Well, yeah. Essentially, in Genesis chapter 6, it briefly talks about the fall of the angels, and then the very next part starts talking about how wickedness and evil would spread among the land, and how humanity had become so corrupted. Now, if you knew more about the book of Enoch, then the readers at that time knew this story and knew what it was talking about. But for a lot of modern people, if they're not familiar with that story, then they don't know, and so it just goes into that saying everyone became corrupted, and then we get the story about how God is going to send the great flood, and so Noah's told to build the ark.
Well,
and so not everyone...
I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, so since not everyone is familiar with the original story of the fallen angels, they don't necessarily put two and two together that the flood was intended as a consequence for the interbreeding of the angels.
Yes. That's basically what I got from it, almost like a karmic value coming back to them.
Sure.
So you definitely agree with the flood, because a lot of researchers that say there was never even a flood of any kind.
Yeah, well, I think there's too many stories you find all throughout the world mentioning some kind of flood disaster. Like I said, now whether or not it actually was to the extent that every inch of the land surface was covered by water, I don't know. I find that a little hard to believe. However, I do think that with what we know about the possibility of global warming and ice caps melting and everything like that, that we know in the ancient world that there were great disasters and brought about ice ages and things. So the ancient texts all around the world talk about how there was this natural disaster and how some of the gods came to the rescue of humans to help save them from being completely wiped out.
Is this ancient text you're referring to, the Atrahasis?
Well, there's that, or even the Hopi Indians or other Native American cultures. They talk about how the gods, well, not so much the gods, but the spirit people, and I think they even sometimes refer to the ant people that came to the rescue of humans and told them to hide out in mountains and caves to avoid being destroyed in the flood.
So a lot of what we're referring to comes from the Sumerian text, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and a lot of the origin of the stories, like what we find with the story of Noah, you can also find in the older text of the Sumerian culture, where it has Utnapishtim. I'm sorry, what?
There's a difference between the written stories and the oral stories of Aboriginal tribes all over the world. The Aboriginal tribes tell a story that not one family survived the flood, because that would be incest, as is told in the written stories. I'm just giving some different perspectives here so that people understand that there's not just, 2 flood stories or 3 flood stories that are written down. There's differences in the stories with the written and the oral stories.
Yep.
Yeah, there are so many different variations, but if you look at the commonality, they all talk about some sort of great flood devastating the land. So that's what I find interesting.
Do you believe in the possibility? What was that?
I was going to say also there's, I've also watched several documentaries and done some research, but there's water erosion on the pyramids and the Sphinx, and then some people say that it's sand erosion over time.
Yes, that was actually my question, Mel. I wanted to ask him, does he believe that the flood actually reached that region of Egypt?
Again, I don't know. I haven't come across any academic or scholarly research that conclusively proves that. I've definitely heard the theories, just like everyone else, where they talk about, I think it's Robert Schoch was one of the geologists that put forth that the water erosion theory, and that would place the pyramid as being built sometime prior to 10,500 BCE. So, yeah, I've definitely heard a lot of those theories, and whether or not that's actually how history went down, I don't know. It's not really for me to say. I don't have access to some of the scholars and other researchers that have studied this. I think it's possible. I do also think that the Great Pyramids themselves were probably built using a method of essentially a poured concrete. They're finding more research to support that now whenever they do microscopic analysis.
Yes, I have actually heard some research and read some research on that actual theory there about the poured. Yeah,
give us your concept on that. Could you explain it a little bit more? Because I basically heard you stating that on another show, and that was very fascinating.
Yeah, I haven't been able to fully research into all of this, but essentially what it would be is some sort of, it's known as a geopolymer, which they're finding that the ancient Egyptians could have easily made this stuff, which was essentially like a concrete. And so that it helps solve the problem of, a lot of people say, well, how were the pyramids built with the blocks so big and everything so high? And they say, well, originally one of the theories was that they used ramps, and they dragged these giant stones and haul them up the ramps, and they used so many slaves and this and that. But unfortunately, the ancient records don't seem to support that view. I mean, they don't say that there was a huge slave race that was used. The number of people that it would require is too many for what any of the records tell us. And the amount of work to actually build...
Egyptology states that it took them, 30 years supposedly?
Yeah, I think that's about right.
Yes, and what the scientists are proving now that could have been impossible during the time, especially with the tools used.
Yeah, and so what one of these newer theories, whenever they started doing some microscopic analysis, I believe, I don't remember exactly, but I think that they even found like hair fibers and other things in the stone blocks.
Amazing.
And the material was composed in a way that they could tell that it was actually something that was at once sort of a liquid type form that was then solidified very quickly. And so that solves a lot of the problem about the ramps, because a lot of people also point out that the amount of work that would go into building the ramps is more than actually building the pyramid.
My God, yeah.
Yeah, so if they were able to use this concrete mixture, this geopolymer type stuff, they could essentially build the framework and then just pour it into place, and then that would also be why every block was so precise, and why there's like no space in between each block and everything like that, because they just had a framework that they were able to pour the blocks into.
Well, one thing that I have also done, and I have also done research into that very subject right there that you're talking about. And one thing that they cannot explain away is the fact that when you pour a form, you will have an edge that's going to be in between one block and another that causes that separation, and they can't figure out how they move that block into place after they remove the form.
Yes.
But that's just one point that I had seen whenever I had done my research. The rest of it all, pretty much, it fits right into play, and it sounds like it might be the way that they built the pyramid.
Yeah, and I'm a supporter of that theory for right now. I think that's the best candidate for explaining how it was done. Unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to research more into it because I've just been so busy with getting ready for conventions and some of my other jobs and things that I do, but that's definitely something that's on my list to explore further.
Oh, there's so many different theories on it. It's fascinating to me. Any of the pyramids all over the world, not just the pyramids at Giza.
Sure, and the fact that there are pyramids built all over the world, I think, is a clue for us too.
Yes,
wow,
absolutely.
yeah.
We have discussed that on this show, that very subject right there, as a matter of fact.
So, what's your interpretation of these fallen angels and the gateways that you refer to in your book?
Okay, well, essentially, we're told that the angelic beings would reside in the heavenly realm, and that they essentially the only way that they could interact in our realm was that they had to take on flesh and blood bodies. Now, the text never really elaborated on how this happened, but they did. Whenever I started doing the research, I found so many references to these gateway devices. For instance, the term for Babylon actually means gateway of God, or gateway of the gods. And that's where I get the title of the book, because I was just amazed at how many references I found to these ancient gateways. And whenever I was looking into the ancient stories, it seemed to say that these weren't just normal doorways or anything, but these were some kind of, whether you want to call it magical or scientific type device that would essentially translate a being from one realm into another. So if the angels are existing in what was known as the heavenly realm, and they weren't compatible with our realm, what these gateway devices would do is essentially analyze the spirit form of the angel, and then construct a body for it over here that its soul or whatever could inhabit. And so it would basically give the angel a body so that it could cross over into our realm and interact with us. And we find all sorts of stories, whether we're talking about Jacob's ladder with the angels ascending and descending, Nebuchadnezzar and the fiery furnace, or even the Egyptian pyramids, which the word pyramid means fire in the center. And the ancient Egyptians referred to like the capstone as the Ben, which it was in reference to the Bennu bird, which was the Egyptian form of the Greek phoenix, and the pyramids were meant as these resurrection or translation device or machines for the pharaohs. And
oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No.
There are also some theories on the pyramids were a gateway. You go in and do a type of meditation, like a Merkaba meditation, and it transforms you almost into a light being, if you will, and then you're able to go to different places. In other words, like a Stargate or something, which kind of brings is like a segue into the question I was really wanting to ask you about, but I'll save that for a little bit till you're done with your discussion.
Okay. Well, as far as what you were just saying a moment ago, I've heard that theory too. I don't quite know if I completely subscribe to that view, because from what I gather reading the ancient texts, to me it suggests that it was more physical, that we were actually talking about shifting from one dimension into another physically. For instance, if you read in the book of Enoch, it tells us how Enoch was taken away, and he walked with God, but that he was basically translated into the heavenly realms whenever he met the angels and God. And what I find very interesting is I looked up 3 different translations of the book of Enoch. And in one, I remember it says that Enoch, whenever he appeared in front of God, it says that his whole body became relaxed. But there were 2 other translations that actually said that all of Enoch's flesh dissolved, and essentially he was transformed into the angel Metatron, if we read further in the what was known as the Book of Enoch 2, or the 2 Enoch. But so we have the story where it's actually describing how Enoch, it says his flesh was dissolved, and yet he was still alive, talking to the angels and everything, but he took on this glorious shining appearance. And so I think that it's more talking about some sort of physical transformation than just some sort of meditative state.
Well, the theory that I heard that from actually was referring to the sacred geometry of Metatron's cube. And actually I read that the Merkaba and the sacred geometry come together, and with the pyramid, it's like a chakra to the earth. It helps because you become one with your spiritual self. So in other words, it would be a translation, but it would be from a material to a spiritual translation.
Yeah.
Instead of a material to a material. I just had to bring that point up. Like I said, I'm not trying to shoot down anybody's view, because I read from all different kinds of people, and I enjoy everybody's different perspective. I'm just trying to put more out here.
Yeah, I'm curious. Could you elaborate more on like the source where you remember reading about that?
It was actually several different places, and actually talking to several different people. I could go through my e-books and my books, and I could find it for you right quick, but right off the top of my head, I really can't spit that out for you.
Okay, I was just curious if you remembered, but yeah, that's no problem.
Yes, well, we just opened up the chat room, so anybody trying to get into the chat, please come in and ask any questions, and we'll be taking callers in about 5 minutes from now, and the number is 347-215-7949. So I noticed you mentioned the capstone. What's your perspective on why it's missing?
I really don't know. The ancient legends say that it was supposed to be either made of solid gold, or that it was at least gold-plated. And as I was saying before, what the ancient Egyptians referred to the capstone as was the Ben-Ben, and that referred to the Bennu bird, which was the phoenix. And so, I'm not quite sure whether it actually did have some sort of function with the pyramid. I mean, you would think so, otherwise why would they need it? Or it could have just been more of a symbolic representation of what was going on inside of the pyramid. But essentially, like I said, it was called the Ben-Ben, and the pyramid itself was referred to as a resurrection machine for the pharaoh. So whenever you look at the story about the phoenix, it was the bird that would die in the ashes and then be resurrected in the fire. And so we get that same kind of imagery with the fire symbolism, because the pyramid and the triangle were often used in esoteric circles to represent fire and transformation. And even knowledge a lot of times. So we get the same symbolism recurring again and again, And so I think that the capstone might have been symbolically representing what was happening inside of the pyramid, where part of the reason perhaps why they've never found any of the original burials of the ancient pharaohs is that they were translated into another dimension. Of course, I mean, they could have been grave robbed, like a lot of other people think, but if you look at what the ancient texts say, if it happened the way that they say, then maybe that's why there is no body.
Interesting perspective there.
So you would... Oh, go ahead.
My bad. Go ahead. I cut you off.
You were sort of getting somewhere with the pyramids. I'm sorry about that. What's your actual perspective on them? Do you subscribe to the concept of ancient tombs, or are you really pointing more towards the translation theory?
Well, a little bit of all of the above. Essentially, with the Egyptian pyramids, we're told that they were intended as tombs for the pharaohs, but we're also told, as I was explaining, that they were meant as resurrection machines. So after the pharaoh died, they probably did move the body in there and perform their rituals and things, and if there was some sort of gateway device housed within the pyramid, then it might have actually translated the pharaoh into the heavenly realms. And the reason we might just not have access to this gateway device, it might have been removed, and so now we're just left with the pyramid housing.
Well, what did you say that's what Egyptology sort of keeps hidden? Because I noticed they never mention anything about it being a resurrection tomb rather than just a tomb itself.
Well, actually, they do. It's just that they relegate it more to superstitious myth. Like I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with Dr. Zahi Hawass, and how he always seems to be like censoring and jumping on people about stuff, and yeah, I know that sometimes it can be very frustrating dealing with somebody like that, but at the same time, if you actually read some of his books, he says that no, the Egyptians built the pyramids, it wasn't aliens or anything like that, that he believes the Egyptians built it and it was intended as a tomb for the pharaoh, because he said the ancient Egyptian texts say that it was a tomb because they intended it to be a resurrection machine. So in a roundabout way, even Zahi Hawass is supporting the idea of it being a resurrection machine, if for no other reason than because he wants everyone to know that he thinks it was intended as a tomb, and so he's referring to the ancient writings and everything that said that it was meant to be a resurrection machine. Now, if you asked him, does it actually resurrect the pharaoh or transport them into the heavenly realms, I have a feeling he'd probably deny that and think that it was more of a superstitious belief. But the point is, he's still saying that it was intended as a resurrection machine. He just doesn't believe it actually functioned that way.
Yeah, people have to know the bias with Dr. Hawass, because he's an Egyptian, of course, so of course he wants everything in that area to basically fall in the lap of the Egyptians, of course, which I put that disclaimer out for people to really research beyond just Dr. Hawass's work.
Yeah, definitely. But I do think that they should read it to at least get his perspective on it, and then they should go and look at other theories and things that are out there, because the Egyptian civilization was a very great civilization, and it definitely was involved and interacted with many other cultures. So to believe that they were like in a little bubble and just did their own thing isn't true. I mean, they interacted with all sorts of other cultures and brought in the belief systems of other cultures and adapted it to their own needs. So, yeah, for someone like Zahi Hawass that just wants to sort of keep them in their own little bubble, I think that's a bit wrong. But there are many other theories out there that I think are all worth looking into.
Definitely.
Speaking about resurrection machines, I got a question here for you. What do you think they're doing out there at CERN with this particle accelerator?
Oh, well, actually, that's interesting. I know there's a lot of people that are worried that essentially they're going to blow up the world. But, which, I mean, yes, in the realm of possibilities, by the definition of the word, anything is possible. However, I think the probability of them actually doing something like that is very remote, because they've done. Well, essentially what they're trying to get online right now is the Hadron Collider, which it's this very large ring that's essentially going for miles and miles and miles underneath the Earth. And what they're trying to do is find these particles known as gravitons and other subatomic particles that might prove that there are other dimensions existing in this hyperspace realm. And
well, I heard of one that was essentially trying to create antimatter. Have you ever delved into that?
Who is they?
I haven't heard specifically of that. I'm sorry, what?
Who is they that you keep referring to?
The people at CERN.
The people at CERN?
Yeah, the people at CERN, the scientists. What they're trying to do is essentially they'll fire off these very small particles, and they go racing through this tube that goes for miles and miles under the Earth, and it's in an oval shape, so it comes around, and essentially they try to get these particles to go at near the speed of light. And they fire off one at each end, and so at one point they're hoping that they'll actually collide. And most of them are just going to be glancing blows where then the particles go off in different directions. But every now and then they're hoping to get one where the two particles have a direct impact, and whenever they impact like that, there will be an explosion where it'll reveal all sorts of subatomic particles coming through. And so they're hoping that through that they have all sorts of equipment set up to analyze these subatomic particles, and they'll be able to find some, like I said, like a graviton, which right now is just a theoretical subatomic particle that they believe might actually be leaking into another dimension, which would help explain why gravity is such a weak force when compared to electromagnetic theory. And so they're hoping that if they can find stuff like that and analyze the data, that it would actually prove certain theories like superstring theory and M theory, which support the view of hyperspace. Yeah, in multiple dimensions. So
I'm just kind of curious here as to who's maybe the contractor that's building such a large facility? Maybe who would be funding it? Is it a government that funds it, or because it's between two countries, right? France and Switzerland.
Yeah, I believe so, and I'm not sure of the exact contractors or anything, but I'm sure that information is publicly available. I know a lot of times, for scientific endeavors like that, it does come through some sort of government funding. Or other sources. Specifically, I couldn't tell you, but that's definitely something worth researching.
All right. So, do you have a theory on why they're doing it? Are they trying to come up with a new form of energy, maybe a cheaper form of energy, or is there like another purpose for it? Because making explosions with particles, I mean, that's pretty.
Well, Mel,
broad genre,
I've done some research in that arena. And what I essentially saw was that they were basically trying to state that they were creating antimatter. And if you look in, yes, and this antimatter is basically one of these zero-point energies. That it's basically an infinite energy source that we can tap into. And that's the research that I've delved into. Have you heard of that information, Craig?
I haven't specifically heard of that, but I haven't looked into it in the last few months or anything. But that certainly could be. I mean, if they actually run these experiments, all sorts of possibilities could be opened up as far as new energy forms that they could find in energy alternatives. So that's one of the exciting things about why they're trying to do this, is because the more that they can learn about it, then the more that they learn about how the universe works, and actually, other methods, so that we can stop relying on stuff like oil and other things, and start working on new technologies for energy.
Yes. Well, in that effect, would you think that they could be creating a particular type of gateway through this type of energy source they're tapping into?
Again, I mean, it's possible, but I really can't say. I mean, that would be nothing more than speculation. It'd be certainly fascinating. It'd certainly be fascinating if they did, and I hope that if they did, that As I mentioned in the book just briefly about the idea of running experiments like this, currently it's just speculation, but if we did find a way of tapping into these other dimensions, I would hope that we certainly didn't, tap into the first one as being some sort of evil dimension where, say, all the fallen Watchers were imprisoned. Hopefully we tap into a little bit more pleasant of a dimension.
It's very interesting that you make that point there.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's always, there's a responsibility whenever it comes to science like that where, if they don't do anything, then they run the risk of, we won't make any more discoveries or advancements, and we as a people just die off. But if they do that, they could open up great new possibilities for us, or they could destroy everything. But they're trying to be very, very careful about it. And I know, like, just possibility-wise, there's always the chance something's going to go wrong. But since what they're doing is very scientific, they've had peer review after peer review, and numerous scientists and leading authorities analyze and go over the mathematics and check and double check, and that's actually part of the reason why it's taken so long for them to get the CERN lab up and running, is
you
because
say, plural, like is it like the movie Contact where they have more than one operation going on at the same time, maybe? Where they have more than one of those particle accelerators being built at the same time? Because that was a gateway as well in the movie Contact.
Yeah, and actually, we can get into that in a little bit. But
yeah, definitely.
They do actually have smaller particle accelerators. There are other companies around the world that have these, but this new one that's being built is the largest. And so, unfortunately, right now, the current ones that we have, while they're doing a lot of research, they're just not big enough to try and get the kind of results that they want. So that's why they have to build one so large, because they need the amount of space to do these experiments. For instance, like I said, getting the particles to accelerate to near the speed of light. So that's why they're trying to do this. They've already done a lot of these experiments on a smaller scale with smaller particle accelerators, but they need this big one.
Yes, I was actually trying to segue that into your book and basically the main primer, which is the gateways. Do you actually concur with these other supposed gateways on this earth? Like, basically, we could even get into like the Montauk Project and stuff like that.
Yeah, sure. No, I'm not really sure. I mean, I've heard stories about it, but I really haven't seen anything currently that is saying that we have operational gateways going on. Of course, I mean, if the government or any other group had access to one of these, whether or not we'd actually know about it is a big question, because they'd probably want to keep it secret, at least for the time being. But I really don't want to get into that realm, because, I mean, it's just speculative conspiracy theories then. And so, as far as what we're told from the ancient text, it seems to suggest that the gateways were once active devices that then, after the Watchers did their thing and that the other angels fought against them and imprisoned them, that essentially these gateway devices were deactivated or removed. So that we wouldn't have access to them.
When you speak of the gateway devices that you're talking about, you say translation of material. Do you mean essentially like the Stargate series, how they step through the gate and they end up as their whole person on another side? Or do you mean just like dissipate and come back together in another place?
Okay, essentially like that's very similar. We're sort of combining all of them here. One of the ideas of the gateway devices was that it would move you from one location to another. And so it would be sort of like in Star Trek where they beam from the ship down. And whenever you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, because if you actually look into the history of Star Trek, originally Gene Roddenberry wanted to have them fly down in spaceships, little ships that would come off the mothership. But they didn't have it in their budget, so they found the cheapest it was the teleportation method. And actually, whenever you think about it, it's not only cheaper for television to produce that kind of effect, but it makes more sense scientifically if they were a very advanced scientific group that they would do something like that. So we have a combination of the sort of Star Trek teleportation with the Stargate idea of going to these other planets and things. But the main difference that I'd like to point out in the book is that we're not so much, it seems, talking about moving from our planet to another planet as translating matter from one form into another so that it's compatible with another dimension, like the heavenly realms. For instance, if you wanted to go scuba diving, and so you need to go deep under the ocean water, you need to take certain gear with you and stuff so that you can survive. You need to have air tanks and everything so that you can stay there and exist in that environment. And I think these gateway devices functioned in a similar way, in that we couldn't just move into the heavenly realm. Even though it might only be a millimeter away from us, and surrounding us, we can't just move into it because we're not compatible with that dimension. But so what this gateway device would do would be to make you compatible so that you could interact with the other realm.
Wow. That's amazing.
Maybe, so are you trying to say that these Nephilim and these Elohim, they didn't come here on a spaceship like it states in the Sumerian tablets, but they came through a gate from another dimension, maybe?
Actually, even the ancient Sumerian tablets refer more to the gateways. The whole idea about the spaceships, I'm not aware of anything like that in the ancient texts specifically saying that. A lot of that does come from Zecharia Sitchin, but essentially, like even if you look at what was referenced as Nibiru, that was known as the crossing point or the gate. So you have that reference, but it's not that important in the ancient texts. But you do have other stuff like Babylon. Like I said, Babel meant gateway of God. And
it also
whenever
means to talk a lot too.
Well, yeah, and that's actually what we have is a pun or a play on words.
Yeah.
Because in Genesis chapter 11, whenever it talks about the story of building of the Tower of Babel, we look at it and it says that they were trying to make a name for themselves, which it says building a Shem, and so they were trying to build this tower, and Yahweh, or the angel of Yahweh, looks down, and he's with the divine council up in heaven, and he says, look at what they're doing. If they can succeed in doing that, then nothing will be impossible for them, so we have to go down and stop them from completing this project. And so the angel of Yahweh and other members of the divine council go down and disrupt the work, and you have this play on words where Babel, meaning gateway of God, and then the Hebrew word Balel, which meant to mix or confuse.
Yeah.
And so it was a play on words as to now in modern day, whenever we say somebody is babbling, we're talking about they're just speaking gibberish, or they don't make any kind of sense. They're just going on and on and on.
Wasn't the confusion of tongues also done after the Tower of Babel was built?
Well, yeah, that was the idea, and what we can also get into is what I noticed in my research is that a lot of the stuff that was done in the Old Testament is actually referred to as being undone in the New Testament for like in the end of days. So whenever they had things like the tongues of fire descending upon the apostles, if you go back and read that, it's saying that whenever the apostles were talking to everyone, no matter what language the audience natively spoke, they would have understood the apostles, so it was undoing what was done at the Tower of Babel. And so what we have is a lot of the stuff in the Old Testament is saying, no, humans need to be punished, they can't do this, they can't do that, they're not ready for this. But essentially it's not, it was just saying it wasn't our time to do that stuff. And so what we find in the New Testament is it's saying, go ahead.
This was the God, Yahweh, that was saying this, that the people were not ready, so we have to punish them, right? Was it the creation spirit in your opinion, or was it the God, Yahweh?
This, I would say, would be the angel of Yahweh, which was the physical manifestation, or there was known as like two powers in heaven, and this would be like the physical God, Yahweh, that was head of the divine council.
So there wasn't no name behind that?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
There wasn't a name of that particular angel?
Well, yeah, he was known as Yahweh. But whenever you actually look at the ancient text, there's like two different versions of Yahweh. There is the supreme God of the universe, okay, that is manifested within everything, okay, and then you have another version which was known as the angel of Yahweh, which he was also referred to as Yahweh, but usually they would refer to the angel of Yahweh, which was this physical manifestation. So whenever it's said about the Lord spoke to me and things like that, they're actually talking about the angel of Yahweh physically interacting with humanity at that point.
In that context, wouldn't the Christians believe that Jesus, this angel that you're referring of?
Okay, as far as that goes, Jesus was considered. See, it gets kind of tricky, and actually, for a lot of your listeners, if they want to refer to more of this, Dr. Michael Heiser just started some blogs recently. If they go to Michael S. Heiser, it's Heiser, and he has a series of blogs now that they can subscribe to, where he'll be going over a lot of this research, and there's one specifically I think called The Two Powers in Heaven, and he's also currently working on a book that explains a lot more of this. So I don't quite have the background to explain all the intricacies of it, but yeah, there were these separate powers that were in heaven that were all tied together, but they also were operated separately from each other.
Okay, so you're referring to the Elohim there, or are you referring to just the angels?
Well, Elohim, essentially, Elohim meant the gods. It's a plural word, but it was also used to refer to the God of Israel, Yahweh, because even though it's a plural word, it's one of those words that can be singular depending on the context, the grammar surrounding it. So whenever, like, we have, it says about, and God created humans, even though it says Elohim, and it's a plural word, the grammar is actually singular. So a lot of people like to say the gods created humans, but if you look at the Hebrew text, it's actually saying God singular, even though it's using a plural word. And we have words like that in English today, like deer, sheep, and fish, where it can be a singular or plural, but you don't know until it's used in a sentence. So if you said, I saw a sheep grazing in the field, you know it's singular, but if you said, I saw sheep grazing in the field, you would know that it's plural. And that's the same kind of word. Elohim is, even though it's plural, the grammar dictates whether it should be understood as singular. You mentioned about the Alpha and the Omega, and even during your song that you just played, I heard about, it mentioned about Jesus, and Christos not being the last name, so we can get into all that if you'd like now.
Yes, well, maybe you can tie that into the whole number of 888. So.
Sure, and that's something that a lot of people don't realize is that if you actually look at what was known as the gematria, which the ancient languages, they used to have numerical values assigned to each of the letters, and they did that in Hebrew and the Ugaritic text, and they did it in Greek. And whenever you have Jesus, the name used for him and the title of Christos, actually it adds up to 888 if you break down the values of it. And what I found really interesting was that there's all sorts of numerical symbolism embedded in there that a lot of people don't realize because they didn't necessarily know all of these secrets or mysteries that were taught to the apostles and the people in the ancient mystery schools. So 888 was meant to represent that whenever Jesus makes a statement such as, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, he's saying he has the entire power of the Greek alphabet in his name. And so since it was meant to have like magical properties or power, that's what he was saying by that. But also you can take the Greek alphabet and divide it so it's 888. So it was essentially saying numerically through his name with the 888 that he had the entire power of the alphabet within him, the power of the word.
Wow. So that would be the ancient name for Jesus, correct?
Yeah.
Or would that be
Yeshua,
the Greek?
Well, that would be the Greek, because we're dealing with the Greek gematria there for the numerical values. But yeah, for Yeshua ben Yosef, or if you had Yeshua the Christos. But then even too, it gets interesting whenever you look into the actual etymology of the word Christ or Christos, which it meant the anointed one, and we interpret too as the Messiah. Now, Christos was the Greek version of Messiah. Now, in Hebrew, Messiah would have been Mashiach. Okay, but now if we trace back further, Mashiach.
You're referring to Jesus de Christos, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and so Mashiach meant Messiah and anointed king, and there were many messiahs in the ancient world. It was a title. It meant the anointed king.
Yes. And I think that's the problem with Christianity today, because they actually get that word totally misinterpreted.
Yeah, and actually part of what a lot of people become a little alarmed whenever I bring this up is that it actually has a lot of serpentine symbolism associated with it. Whenever you study the etymology of it, Mashiach goes back from the Hebrew, and then you have surrounding cultures. Like in Sumerian, they referred to the dragon kings, which would have been the Ushum Gal. And so even whenever you're talking about Sumerian, the Shu part of it at the beginning, that meant dragon. Okay, so it was the dragon tongue.
Oh, yeah, because we were getting into this conversation with another guest, and he also brought up the derivative of seraph in the seraphim, meaning a reptile figure.
Yeah, the Egyptian, it meant fiery serpent.
Fiery serpent, wow.
Yeah, and actually, if you look at a lot of like the Pharaoh Akhenaten and some of the other things, like the Pharaoh headdress would have a serpent at the top. Okay, and that was meant as a protective measure because it was intended to represent that the serpent was going to spit its fiery venom at you, and so that's where you get the fiery serpent symbolism.
Would you even the depictions of these reptilians, or I think it's these old carvings that I've seen in stone of depictions of reptilian beings actually coinciding with the Mayans at the time? Have you ever done research into that?
I'm not specifically sure about any dealing with the Mayans. You're welcome to send me email links and everything like that after we get done with the show, and I can look into it.
Yes, I could definitely do that.
The Quetzalcoatl or whatever, the Naga and the Nagas in Asia.
Yeah,
in the world, there's references to reptilians, right?
Yeah, we can get into all that. Real quick, finish up about the Mashiach.
Yeah,
you have in the Sumerian it's Ushum Gal, which meant the angry serpent, or they referred to their dragon kings. So that was a title given to the kings. And then you have in the surrounding cultures, you had I'm trying to remember one of the other terms. In Egyptian, I think it would have been the Mesa, which also sort of, I think, tied in with the crocodile, which I think possibly that what they would have done is essentially sacrificed the crocodile, taken the body fat from it, and that's what they used as the anointing oil. That's where, so that's where we get a lot of it. But so actually, the term Mashiach, whenever you trace the etymology of it back to these other cultures, it had a lot of this dragon serpentine symbolism associated with it. And on top of that, there's a lot of symbols associated with Jesus that we find in other cultures too, dealing with reptilian gods, but not that they were necessarily reptilian, but the dragon element of them was representative of certain features. Such as
yes, I heard you speak of an interpretation of Jesus in one of the old ancient texts, referring to him having serpent-like legs.
Yeah, that's actually in the book of Revelation. At the very beginning, whenever Jesus appears, It describes him as having white skin, white hair, a shining appearance about him, which would have been right in line with the description of the ancient Watchers. They were described as having white skin, white hair, very pale appearance, very similar to an albino. But on top of that, it also says that with all this symbolism that he had feet of burnished bronze. And what I found very interesting, and no one ever seems to bring this up, is that I think that there was a big word play going on here, just like we discussed with other word plays about like Babel. In this case, we're dealing with Greek, okay, but at the same time, Aramaic and Hebrew were very prominent languages at that time. So even though we're dealing with a Greek text, the people of that time would have been familiar with the other languages and gotten the pun here. And so what we have is that the ancient Hebrew word nakash, it meant serpent. That's the same word that's used to describe the serpent in the Garden of Eden, which also meant shining one, because in Aramaic, that word meant brass or shining one. So because brass had a shining appearance. So what you have is this play on words where in Aramaic, the very word nakash meant bronze, but in Hebrew, the same exact word with the same exact spelling meant serpent or shining one. So it's describing Jesus with feet of burnished bronze. And so I was like, well, wait, if that's a play on words, it's saying that he has serpent feet. And what makes that more interesting is whenever you go and you actually look at a lot of the depictions of the ancient gods and the Titans and even Quetzalcoatl, you find that they're depicted with serpentine feet. There's Mesopotamian drawings showing some of the gods where they have the iconic wings and everything like that, but they're also shown with these writhing serpents coming off of their feet, complete with heads and everything. And then I found some Greek and Roman sculptures where it's talking about or portraying the battle of the gods against the Titans. And the Titans in the imagery have serpent legs. And so, it's almost the same exact thing. I show these pictures in the book. If you compare the Mesopotamian drawing to the Greek sculpture, and then whenever you look at a depiction of Quetzalcoatl in the American, Native American cultures, they have he has like these serpentine feet. Now it doesn't have the head of a serpent, but it's still the feet are all wound up, and he was known as the feathered serpent. So they're drawing him with these curly feet, similar to serpent tails being coiled.
Well, the Native Americans also will talk about their serpent brothers, and there's actually one person in specific that I can think of that comes to mind is Red Elk. Whenever he talks on Coast to Coast, he's been on several shows, and basically he describes them as being reptilians.
Yeah, I think I heard that a long time ago. I've heard Red Elk speak. I don't recall anything recently whenever I heard like any encores of his interviews. So it's not fresh in my mind. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of history dealing with that. And even if we want to connect like Quetzalcoatl to Jesus, there's all sorts of symbolism. For instance, the pentagram symbol was actually one of the original symbols for Jesus. Today everyone thinks it's a symbol for Satanism and a symbol for Satan, but in the ancient world it wasn't. A pentagram, a 5-pointed star. A hexagram would be a 6-pointed star.
A 6-pointed star. I know. That's why I know the difference. I was just asking which one
just was, for the audience.
In Israel, they refer to the hexagram, and I was just wondering.
Yeah, but actually the much more ancient symbol was the pentagram, and that was actually the original symbol for Jerusalem, because they found like clay pottery and other things where the precursor to the city of Jerusalem was Shalem. That's where you get Jerusalem.
Is that the same as Salem or Salem?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yes, it is.
Does that translate to peace?
And that was basically ancient Israel as we know it, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so what they found was the ancient pottery for the city, and they actually found pentagrams inscribed on it. And part of the belief was, according to the scholars, was that it was actually dedicated to the deity Shalem, which was associated with this five-pointed star and like the planet Venus. And throughout my studies, what I noticed was that I actually went and got astronomical software to calculate all this on my computer and everything.
Wow.
The ancient astronomers knew that the planet Venus, which was known as the morning star, it would line up with Earth every 584 days. It would line up, and you could plot it in the morning sky. And so.
And what civilization exactly was using this information on Venus?
Well, particularly I'm talking about the Mesopotamians, but actually this was known all around the world, as we'll get into in a moment.
All right.
Because what we know is that they would plot the point, and then it would take 584 more days for it to line up again, and then they'd plot the point. And it would do this a few more times, and essentially it would take a total of exactly 8 years to complete its cycle, where it would return to approximately the same point in the sky. And so it took 8. So you have that 8 symbolism again associated with kingship, and it's associated with Jesus. But now, whenever you plotted those points, whenever it appeared over the course of the 8 years, and you went from one point to the next.
This goes back to the triple eights again?
Yeah, because it took 8 years for this to happen. So you have the 8 symbolism. But so whenever they traced the point from one to the next until it completed the circuit, they found that it traced a pentagram in the sky. And so that's the symbol of the five-pointed star being associated with Venus and the morning star. That's where we get all of that symbolism, and it was a symbol for kingship. And the ancient Maya knew this too, because if you look at all the cultures throughout the ancient world, the vast majority of them had the five-pointed star, and a lot of times they would refer to it as the morning star.
They also used the six-pointed star, the hexagram, with a lot of symbology and sacred geometry and stuff as well.
Oh yes,
so
yes.
is there like a conflict with that, or did they work hand in hand? I'm wondering what your perspective is on that.
I think some of it worked hand in hand. I think actually a lot of the six-pointed star symbolism didn't appear until later. I mean, I know there's a lot of esoteric books that speak about it in the ancient world, but the five-pointed star is definitely older. Is
there a certain reference that I could refer to find this information from it? Because I have not.
Yeah, that's a good question.
You actually have said some things that's quite. You have an interesting point of view on some things that I haven't heard. So.
That's why I want to definitely get all of his information on the pentagram, and we definitely dug into about maybe a quarter of it so far. But the pentagram, wow, there's a lot. Do you actually agree with like the ancient pagans who just believed that the star represented humans with the 5 limbs, or basically the 5 points being the head, the arms, and the feet?
Well, yeah, it's not that I subscribe because of just the ancient pagan view, but I do think that is a much more refined view. That was the original one. Over time, it became corrupted, because actually it wasn't really even until the Middle Ages whenever the pentagram was associated with negativity or with evil. Because you have old Christian.
That was basically when the Satanists took that sign, correct?
Well, yeah, more so even with modern Satanism. In rock bands that use it. And now it's so prevalent, but they really don't understand the history of the symbol.
Yes, they don't know the purpose or meaning behind it, correct?
Yeah, essentially it was very good. And one of the differences, too, is if you notice, the Satanists use the inverted pentagram. And the difference is because what they're doing is they're inverting the meaning of what the original upright pentagram was intended to mean. So they're in a way saying that they know that that it was a good symbol. They're just turning it on its head.
I have a pretty wild perspective on the 6-pointed star, because if we go off that analogy of the pagans believing in the star just as a representation of man with the 5 points, I'm looking at the 6-pointed star from a child's perspective, and I'm like, okay, there's a that 6 point at the very bottom, could that represent a tail? Have you ever delved into that concept or thought?
No, actually I haven't, but I mean that's quite interesting. I'd encourage you to research it more and see if you find anything to support it.
Yes, I am definitely trying to get into that right now. I'm just trying to get different perspectives on that because it's really obvious if we're looking at it from that perspective. But it's pretty it's something that I don't think has been studied so far. So I don't know where I'm going to get with it, but.
Yeah, usually the symbolism I see associated with that is that it's the two interlocking triangles representing the dualities, like male and female.
Yeah, masculine and feminine. Yes.
Material, spiritual. There's a whole bunch of different deeper knowledge you can get from it anyway.
So what else can we tie in with the pentagram that we haven't spoke of so far?
Well, let's see. Like you said, it was the ancient Maya knew that, and that was a symbol for Quetzalcoatl. He was identified as being the morning star and the feathered serpent and everything like that. And what's actually interesting is if you go and you compare side by side a lot of the symbols associated with Quetzalcoatl and then compare them to Jesus, we get the white skin, the white hair.
Well, isn't the morning star also known as Lucifer?
Well, yeah, but originally it wasn't intended. It just meant light bringer. And so what we have is the whole story about Lucifer rebelling and everything like that actually isn't really found in the Bible. You have a very short reference where it's talking about like the king of Tyre, or it's addressing one of the other kings and comparing him to this story about this angel that wanted to ascend to the heavenly throne and take over, but then was thrown down to the pits of Sheol, which was the underworld. And so it was just comparing the king to that mythology. But where we actually get that story about Lucifer trying to overtake the throne and everything is, as I was saying about the planet Venus, it rises in the morning sky, and it was known as the morning star, because since it's in the inside orbit, it's closer to the sun than the Earth is, it can't rise as high in the sky as other planets that are further out in the solar system. So whenever it first appears in the morning, it's one of the brightest objects in the sky, second to the moon. So whenever it appears, it's a very bright object in the morning sky, and it gets higher and higher, and then just as the day breaks and the sun starts to rise higher, you have Venus and the sun in this race, and Venus is getting higher and the sun is getting higher, and then eventually the sun overtakes it and Venus sinks back down to, below the horizon and out of sight. And so you have that same symbolism that the ancient people developed, where that was representing this being that was trying to rise higher than the sun, and take over the throne of heaven, but it could never succeed, and eventually the sun, representing God, overtook it. So that's where you get the whole story about the Luciferic rebellion, but the story about Lucifer leading the angels and everything, it's not really found in the biblical text.
Yeah, there's a lot of praising of planets as gods or deities. Like, if you listen to that song, he's mentioning the belief of Saturnalia, or religion, you can call it, the ancient religion, and how that involved the religion of Saturn being the god El. Is there any correlation with Venus in that same interpretation of Venus being looked at upon as a god or praised?
Yeah, I'm not really quite sure. I mean, I know that there was definitely, like, the ancients would associate certain planets with the gods, but I don't think that they actually felt that the planets themselves were physical gods in that capacity. I think a lot of the mythologies were sort of, you have a mixture of the different belief systems. You have some of the stories were intended as literal history, and other ones were meant more as allegorical teachings or passing on important knowledge. So as far as associating gods with certain planets, yeah, I mean, you do have the association of Lucifer with the planet Venus, but for no other reason really than it's just in title. Lucifer meant light bringer, and in like the Hebrew text, it was called Hallel ben Shakar, which meant morning star.
Yes, there we go.
And
yeah, that's
so
that's the actual interpretation.
Yeah. Now, as far as associating like the stories of the gods with a lot of like these heavenly battles and with constellations and everything, what I try to address at the beginning of the book is that not all of the stories were meant to be intended as read literally. For instance, in the Sumerian text, we have the story about the Epic of Gilgamesh and how there's a segment where he talks about how he had to battle against the Bull of Heaven. And he had a companion with him known as Enkidu. Now, if you actually analyze the text, it sounds like this epic battle going on, but it's really just talking about the passage of one age into the next. And in this case, it was the slaying of the Bull of Heaven, the end of the age of Taurus, the bull.
Well, could this figure Enkidu actually be somehow related to the Sumerian god Enki? Is this just like a derivative of that name, or?
Well, he was given that title because I think he had something like the god Enki had something to do with helping to like civilize him or something like that. It's been a while since I read it, but that is partially where he got it. Or he was like dedicated to the god Enki.
Okay, there we go. So yeah, that's what I was looking for.
Yeah. Yeah, so that is where we get Enkidu in the title. But what it also meant was like hairy one, and it was saying that he was described as being very shaggy with hair. And so we're given the image of a very primitive man. But actually, whenever we look at this with the eyes for like looking up in the sky, we have Gilgamesh the hunter, and he's described as having a bow and a sword and a belt. And so if we compare that to the constellation of Orion the hunter, we see that he's often portrayed with a bow and a sword or an axe, and we always hear about Orion's belt. And if we look at the constellations, he is actually opposite, like facing the Pleiades, which was part of the Taurus constellation with the Bull of Heaven. So we have Gilgamesh battling Taurus, the bull, and the Pleiades was known as the Seven Sisters. And what we have in the story of Gilgamesh battling this, it says that the Bull of Heaven had the 7 weapons that are unleashed upon him, and he had to battle against it, and then he was able to slay it. And so again, we have the mention about 7 weapons, and then you have the Pleiades, the 7 sisters, in the Bull of Heaven, and on top of that, he has the companion Enkidu, which, as I was saying, meant shaggy-haired one. Well, in the ancient texts, we also know that they referred to comets as shaggy-haired stars. So I think that what we actually have in the story.
Could this also
we got a caller, but we'll get into the caller right after you're finished with this.
Sure. So we just have the story, with I think that Enkidu was more or less representing some sort of comet or very important astronomical event that was also tied with Gilgamesh, or in this case Orion, battling against the Bull of Heaven and slaying the Bull of Heaven, ushering in the new age.
Well, could this not only be a metaphoric story, but also a physical story as well? Because we know that these people that are into mysticism, that the powers that be or whatever, will often use symbolism and actual things that they do. So could this also be a physical as well as a metaphysical or metaphorical?
That's something that's possible. However, I do think that looking back at text like that, I think that it was more meant to convey a certain type of knowledge and information that they were trying to somewhat veil, so that you only really understood it if you were sort of initiated into that and you could understand it. But I don't really think it was meant to be interpreted literally, in this specific situation at least.
Okay, great. Let's get into this caller right quick. We got a caller from 718. Where are you calling from, and what's your name?
Yo, hello, Long.
What's happening, bro?
Hey, what's going on, Long? How you doing?
Just doing my thing, man. Trying my best to stay afloat. That's about
we
it.
got
That's about it.
we got Big Long on the line. He got his own show on Blog Talk Radio.
Thank you. I get a round of applause and everything. Good God.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Well, what's your question for Craig Hines today?
It was more of a statement or a remark of sorts. I would have to say this whole thing about it's all being astrological, like the Zeitgeist boys suggest. I just
have you seen that movie, Craig? The Zeitgeist movie?
No, I've heard about it. I have not seen it, although I actually heard quite a lot of problems with the research and everything that's in it. But I try to be fair and look into that stuff. I just have not had a chance to see it yet.
Okay.
Well, it's pretty much something that pretty much grabs just right there out in the front of you information and puts it into a really good film. In fact, a little too good. You know, I start to wonder about the Zeitgeist guys a little bit. You know, being that they don't touch about Jesuits. But anyway, that's another story. Now, I was looking at some of this, the law of the so-called goddess that wanted to take over heaven. And make no doubt about it, it most certainly is a goddess. And it's the word of the law is Thelema. Thelema. And this is what the Catholic Church, well, actually the hierarchy, the inner circle of them go by, and the inner circle of Islam go by. This is the law of their God. All right, and this God has been made up in many different forms. And in this law that I have in front of me, it specifically says as well that you will make many symbols to worship me. It's literally the God talking. You know what I mean? Like wrote it down themselves. And saying, you will make many symbols to worship me, though you will know me as my own special name. And the fools, because he refers to the people as fools all the time, well, the fools will all worship these symbols and not for me. You know what I mean? So she mentions how she's going to do this. And this is also in these teachings, it tells how to do a sacrifice, literally with a child's blood. And this is no joke. All right, and let me see here. Matter of fact, if you like, I'll read a little bit to you, if you like. You know.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay. All right.
Got a little time.
Let's see here. I'm starting off from I-49 of this. Abrogate are all rituals, all ordeals, all words and signs of Ra-Hor Kayut. That's her name. All right, and that's a trilateral union name, and that's where the whore comes from. Is the whore of Babylon is the whore in the middle because she's the goddess of war and you know all types of killing and stuff. But anyway, here we go. Have taken his seat in the east at the equinox of the gods. All right. Now they use the references of the solar system in this, but this is a person talking. And let Asar be with Isa, Asar being like Aset, Asar, and Haru, and then it changed to Isis and Horus. And yeah, it changed, and Isis, Horus, Osiris stuff. All right, well, anyway, here we go. And Isa was Jesus, all right? Anyway, who also are one, but they are not of me. Let Asar be the adorant. Let Isa be the sufferer. Jesus suffering on the cross. People still saying that didn't happen, stuff like that. These things happened. Hor, in his secret name and splendor, is the Lord initiating. There is a word to say about the hierophatic task. Behold, there are 3 ordeals in one, and it may be given in 3 ways. The gross must pass through fire. Let the fine be tried in intellect. Let the fine be tried in intellect. Now, let me repeat that. The gross must pass through the fire. Okay, so everybody who's not initiated into the Luciferian teachings, and that's the teachings of the light, all right? That's not like, oh, it's the bringer of light. It's the teachings of the light. Lucifer was the bringer of light, yes, but Lucifer was a real being. He educated people that in a little secret section there. And that secret section was blossoming or something, and then therefore there was another little sect off the side, and that's where you get the little Babylonian whore thing. All right, but anyway, the gross must pass through the fire. That means everybody uninitiated, they got to get burnt. Just plain and simple. You ain't initiated, you ain't jumped into the gang yet. Well, you know, you're considered weak. Stomp you out. That's the way it goes. And all the intellect all those with intellect can be tried. You know what I mean? They could have trial. They could have the right to speak for themselves. These things affect ourselves today because we see in society, if you don't have legal contract, you can't present yourself if you don't own yourself. Yeah. So you get tried by fire. You just fuck you, go to the fire. Excuse my language. But this is just a little bit of it, and let's see what you guys think about that so far, because there's way more. But
what's your thoughts on the
this
the
is like 5,000 BC, by the way.
Oh yeah. What's your thoughts on that, Craig? The concept of the trilateral gods being Isis, Ra, and El. Do you believe in that concept?
I've only vaguely heard about some of that. When did the caller say that this text was written, or who was the author?
This is around 6,000 BC. Let me get to the author page. Hold on a second. I'll get that for you right now.
Okay.
Because
I know a lot of that, it was reminding me of something like by Aleister Crowley. I think he had something about the law of Thelema. But
as a matter of fact, it was actually Aleister Crowley that reprinted this with his students. Okay.
Well, see
wow.
That's why I'm wondering if that's actually an ancient text that he's referring to, or if it's just his own stuff.
It's not referring. No. It's literally translated. And I will not read some of the words in this text because they are of spells. They do invoke spirits that you don't want around you. All right, and that's blending with the dimensions and opening up what you might call these vortexes and these gates. All right, this is alchemy, and in alchemy you must be very responsible with it. You know, I won't post this online. I won't give out the exact information to people either. You know, I'll tell you, yes, Aleister Crowley reprinted this, but this is his name, the priest of Princess Ankyufan Kanhoso, and you can find that pretty much in the before domination of Egypt, ancient mysteries, before the domination of Egypt by the Greek and Persian Empire.
I'm not completely sure about a lot of. I haven't researched a whole lot about Crowley, but my one problem with a lot of his stuff is he was somewhat of a practical joker, where he loved the attention. You know, so like he loved being known as the Beast and this and that.
Well,
so
he
a lot of
was pretty serious about his mysticism too, and you know, something
he
was
but
by him and his students. And
alchemy is real.
Yes,
alchemy is real. That's just all there is to it. I mean, making.
Well, Craig, you actually talk about alchemy in your book, correct?
Yeah, I do. I try to go with the more ancient references to it. For instance, like Egypt was known as Kem, the land of Kem, and so the Arabic term al-Chem is where we get the term alchemy.
Exactly.
Referring to like the philosopher's stone type of alchemy, or
the practice, ritual practice.
Okay.
You know, that's what I'm talking about. The pronunciation of certain words. You know, there's certain things you say a certain way. There's certain things you write down a certain way. The language of creation, that is alchemy. The language of creation, because we're all co-creators. We all can do it. And that's why it's not given away, literally, just handed to the people in practice of teaching you how to do so. Because that, once again, that's being initiated into the teachings of the light. All right? It's a difference. You know, it's like you could talk about the history of it to your heart's content, but the simple practice is something that stays the mystery in the public mind. That's what I'm talking about. It's real.
Solomon also was very deep into that too. Am I correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Keys of Solomon.
Every great magician and sorcerer king was.
Mm-hmm.
If I remember, a lot of like the Keys of Solomon texts, those were more of a medieval text, I think. But I don't believe they were actually.
And yes, they were sigils, and actually, I have a book right here, actually.
Well, you see, I have a lot of those texts too, but a lot of that stuff was more of medieval origin. Whenever people were involved in a lot of like the Kabbalistic and other things like that. So a lot of it, from what I've been able to trace, does go back as old as what they tell you. They make it sound like a lot of this stuff goes back to the very ancient world, but a
like
lot
Ethiopia?
of it you can't.
Solomon
was very closely tied
to the whole medieval European thing.
Well, no. I mean, Solomon. If we're actually talking about Solomon, as far as the ancient Solomon, then yes. But as far as something like the Keys of Solomon, from the research I've seen, that was not actually an authentic book. That it doesn't go back to the ancient time.
So you're saying it was written in a latter day?
I do have to make a clarification. When I speak about something, I'm just referring to this one book. I do my homework on whatever research I do. I study the topics, whether somebody's writing something positive, whether it's old, new, or somebody's writing something negative. Because in order to understand some knowledge, you have to look all around it, all the knowledge.
No doubt. Well, we're going down to the last minutes here. Did you have any more questions, Lon, that you wanted to put out real quick?
Oh, no, man, I was just giving a little statement. I appreciate what you guys are doing, and much love to you. And
well, you know what? We appreciate you sharing the stuff with us, definitely, because like we say here, all perspectives are taken very highly here. So we definitely appreciate your call, brother, and we'll probably be talking to you in a minute, too.
All right, then, no problem. I mean, do you want me to hold or hang up?
The show's about to end in a minute, so we'll get you back online probably next week, hopefully.
I got you. All right,
cool. All right, thanks again. That was Lon calling. We definitely appreciate his call. He has a lot of different perspectives on things. Well, we're coming down to the last 10 minutes. Let's definitely get into your book and basically what the readers will be finding in your book and what they're going to come away after reading it.
Okay, well, essentially, I start off with examining the original story about the fallen angels, like we discussed, where it was referring to the Watchers coming down and interbreeding with humans. And I offer several, possibilities. Like some of it I say can be explained, through constellations and other stuff that wasn't intended to be literal, and then other stuff I say that it does seem to be more of a literal historical teaching that they're telling us about.
Yes, because you do a lot of debunking of your own work in your research in your books, correct?
Yeah, I even have a whole appendix in the back of the book where I'm challenging my own theories and saying about this could be wrong or that could be wrong, and I try to give my readers as many different possibilities for things to consider, because I don't want them to walk away, just thinking of one particular theory. Because I know that's a problem I've had with a lot of other authors. Whenever you read it, and the author might have made a convincing argument, but whenever you go back and look at it, they also left out a lot of information, or they didn't bring up something that really would have changed the whole theory about that. And so I tried to offer a lot of different explanations and things, and for people to decide. And some of the stuff I go over and say, well, this is another theory, but this doesn't really hold as much weight because we can debunk it this way or we can debunk it that way. And so I try to whittle away at it and come through with something that I think makes the most sense and explains all the different aspects. Because, for instance, we have the whole idea of the interbreeding. Well, we know from modern science that two completely different species can't interbreed. You can't mate a shark with a lion. Okay?
Exactly.
It's just it's not naturally going to happen.
Exactly.
But now some people will say, well, through genetic manipulation and everything like that, yeah, you can. But what I try to suggest is that according to what the ancient texts are telling us, if the angels actually had these bodies that were formed for them through these gateways, they could have been compatible enough with humans to mate with us, since they would have a basic generic body blueprint. And that would also explain why a lot of their offspring had genetic deformities. Like we're told that the giants grew to enormous size and had elongated heads and had 6 fingers and things like that. And I go over even the elongated craniums, because there are some skulls that have been found that lack the median knitting. Because we know whenever a baby's born, their skull is formed in different parts that then fuses together as they grow up. And so the whole idea for that is their head has to be born with these separate sections so that they can fit through the birth canal because their head is so huge. And, so the idea is they found some of these skulls that lack the median knitting. They have some of the knitting, but not all of it. And
is this the Nazca skulls?
There was one found in Malta, and actually I was also told that there are some that can be found in the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, but I haven't had a chance to check that out yet, so there might actually be more of a medical explanation that I just haven't come across yet, and I'd like to research that to see if there's another possibility.
What's your actual reference on the deformities? Where can people find this work? Because I actually haven't heard it from anybody else besides you, and it's very interesting.
Yeah, the elongated skull, what first came to my attention was an article written by Adriano Forgiani in Atlantis magazine. I think it was like issue number 43 or something like that. And he was discussing these elongated skulls that were found in the Malta region, and what he noticed was they're not just elongated, but the one had was lacking the knitting, like I explained earlier. And he said that it was also buried with what they believed was part of this cult associated with the Watchers. So there were other trinkets and things which led him to believe that there was actually a connection there. And so what I put forth in the book is thinking, well, okay, if the Watchers were actually formed as what it seems to be described in the ancient text, that they wouldn't need to have their skulls in different sections. So they wouldn't need it like a human does, so their skull would be fully formed. If they passed on any of those genetics to their offspring, perhaps that is why the Nephilim might have had these elongated skulls with lacking part of the knitting and everything. But again, it's just speculation, and so I'd really like some more scientific and medical literature, if there's any I can find or anybody knows about it, to inform me. So I'm definitely looking for other explanations, but I'm just saying that's one possibility. So yeah, I get into all of that. I cover paranormal investigation with ghosts, and we're picking up electronic voice phenomena and other things which might be evidence of parallel dimensions that are existing right beside our own that we just haven't quite found a way to tap into, and then explaining with modern theoretical physics how these other dimensions could exist right beside us. And so I'm trying to tie all this stuff together, and then we jump into modern alchemy and the idea of it wasn't so much turning lead into gold, but it symbolically represented turning a human into a divine being. And,
wow.
And so that was really, the great work that they were after through the idea of squaring the circle and the Philosopher's Stone was making humans divine and reuniting heaven and earth. And which this is all discussed even in like the New Testament with the idea of the resurrection, and that humans becoming the co-rulers alongside God, and so we have all the same symbolism associating and coming up again and again. And as I mentioned earlier in the show, a lot of what I noticed is that things that are mentioned in the New Testament as what must happen regarding the human race and our potential is essentially undoing all of the stuff that was done in the Old Testament, like how we were banished from the Garden of Eden, how the building of the Tower of Babel was stopped because it wasn't our time to do that, and how we weren't allowed to eat from the tree of life and knowledge of and everything. And so the New Testament seems to be saying that in the end of days it's up to humans that once we have unlocked the knowledge, it will be our time to do all this, and then we will reunite heaven and earth and be these co-rulers alongside God and actually be superior to the other angels. And what I also find interesting is if you look at the Book of Enoch, it says at the very beginning of the Book of Enoch that this text is not intended for this generation, but a very remote one in the future, and that no one will be able to understand this until that generation has arrived. And what a lot of the modern translators of the Book of Enoch, because it was missing for so many years until they found a few copies a couple centuries ago, and were able to translate it.
And that was the Ethiopian stuff, correct?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, and now they're finally starting to get a very modern picture and able to piece together everything from the Book of Enoch and finally understand it. Because it was originally endorsed by the church authorities, but eventually it fell out of favor because they didn't like the idea of what it was talking about, angels taking on physical bodies and interbreeding with humans, and plus it was very confusing. It didn't make a lot of sense to them, so it was originally endorsed, and you find all sorts of references to it in the New Testament and the ideas that is put forth in the Book of Enoch. But then, centuries later, it had fallen out of favor and essentially disappeared, only to reappear again later. And now we're finally starting to understand it. And if my interpretations of what they're talking about is correct, I think now we are actually approaching a time where we're supposed to do this kind of stuff so that we can reunite heaven and earth.
Isn't it kind of funny? It wasn't used because they didn't like it. They fell out of favor with it, even though it was originally, they were in favor of it.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of references in the New Testament, not only quoting from the Book of Enoch, but where they're talking about the angels that were chained in Tartarus and this and that, and the angels that sinned and didn't stay in their own realm and lusting after women. So you have all that original story about the fall of the Watchers, but yet it's not mentioning anything about the Luciferic rebellion that most people, if you ask on the street, would tell you.
Yeah.
And so the original story about the fall of the Watchers is the more authentic version, and it's only now that we're finally starting to get the whole picture about what it concerned and what it means for our future.
Well, as for all the listeners who tuned in today, we actually missed a lot of calls because my board was going haywire up the show. So I'm sorry about that. That's why I'm hoping maybe we can get you back on maybe 2 weeks from now, and definitely get back into all the callers we missed because of this inconvenience that happened with Blog Talk. Are you able to do that maybe?
Sure, yeah. It's only the month of June. I'll be really busy the month of June, but for the rest of this month I should be clear.
Well, what we're going to do is try to schedule you in as soon as we can, as soon as we got an opening, because we got a few shows going on. But please give out your website and your contacts and basically where they can pick up your great book.
Sure, thank you. The website is gatewayofthegods.com, so same title as the book. And actually, I'll offer to your listeners until the end of the month, they can get free shipping. If they order from me, I'll autograph it and everything. They just need to enter the coupon code Paranormal101 whenever they place their order, and I'll give them free shipping.
Wow.
If they don't want to order from there, then they can go to Amazon.com or Barnes & Noble and order from any of those stores or other places. So basically anywhere books are available. If it's not in stock, you can just ask the bookseller to get a hold of it, and they can order it.
And if it's not at your local bookstores, have them request it. That's what I would suggest.
Yeah, and if they don't want to do that, then, like I said, just go to gatewayofthegods.com, and you can order it directly from me, and I'll autograph it and throw in a few other little surprises.
Well, that's what I would suggest to all the listeners. Go straight to a site, Gateway of the Gods, or type in the Paranormal 101 on the coupon code and get the extras instead of supporting the corporate. Support the mom and pop shops, guys. But we definitely appreciate you having you on and sharing all fabulous information. You have any last words, Melchizedek, for Craig?
Loved having you on the show, man, and a very interesting perspective you have.
Well, thank you very much, and yeah, I'll look forward to doing this again with you guys.
Well, we'll definitely keep in contact, and I'll be giving you an email, and hopefully we can set this immediately because we had a lot of people in the chat, and as I'm looking here, we have a lot of live listeners and callers. So the next show will definitely be on point. I'll have everything loaded up, and we'll take plenty of callers next call. And so we have our great guest. He'll be signing out, Craig Hines. Any last words?
I'll just tell everyone I hope that they can help us all square the circle. If they read the book, they'll get what that means. We interpret the words and meanings to suit his belief system, and trying to get everyone else to believe that too, where unfortunately if you actually have a little bit more knowledge and look into this stuff and look up the words in the ancient dictionaries and everything, you would be able to see that he's taking things out of context or changing the meanings that it doesn't fit what the ancient text actually said, but it fits perfectly with what he wants them to say.
I hate to interject just for a second, but just to clarify for the listeners out there, the difference between Hebrew and Aramaic, isn't that just a dialect difference?
Essentially, yes. Some of the words did have similar or very similar meanings between the two. Sometimes they did mean different things. But for instance, one of the ways that you can tell the difference is in Hebrew, some of the plural words will end with an I-M, with M like Mary, and so you have the word Elohim. Now, that same word in Aramaic would be Elohim. It ends with an I-N. So that's the difference.
Okay.
All right.
That was some great clarification right there also. Thanks. Yes.
You're welcome. And I just want to go on record. I mean, I'm not a Hebrew or Aramaic scholar or anything like that, but I do try to pay attention to the facts and look up the scholarly research. So, I used to be a Sitchin fan. Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you
off.
Okay. I was just going to say that we respect everybody's points of view and stuff here. I dig that about everybody. Everybody has a different one, so.
Yes.
Sure, yeah, and I do too. I mean, I think everyone should have the right to say whatever they want. It's just that if you're going to make certain claims, you should have a way of backing it up, supporting it in some way. And I was one of the ones that whenever I first got on Zecharia Sitchin's material, I thought, wow, this is fascinating and answers so much stuff. But then as I started reading more and actually started looking over the stuff from scholarly sources and getting the ancient dictionaries and looking up the terms for myself, I found that there was a lot of manipulation going on the part of Zecharia Sitchin's material, which makes me not trust the majority of it. I mean, he might have some of the stuff right, but if he's going to manipulate the text, then I don't want to consider that any kind of valid source in my book.
Well, as for Zecharia Sitchin's work, I noticed you're not feeling a lot of his stuff. Is there anything that you're actually aligned with? And maybe you can explain those and maybe explain the things that you're not really subscribed to yet.
Well, I don't know. It's hard to say because it's been so many years since I read a lot of his stuff. People think they know the story where we're told about the fall of the angels involved Satan or Lucifer rebelling and bringing down a third of the angels and essentially just going completely against God's commandments and wreaking havoc on the earth. But that's only partially correct, and actually if you go back and read the biblical text and a lot of the supporting culture view, we find that the original story of the fall of the angels didn't involve a character named Lucifer at all, but it involved the Watchers, which was a group of heavenly angels that basically, while in heaven, they were sent down to basically teach humans about civilization, give them the building blocks of civilization, and to take care of us. And while they were here, they essentially became corrupted. They became enamored with the lovely human women and decided that even though it wasn't their place to do so, they were going to marry and interbreed with the humans. And that was the real rebellion that took place in the ancient world, and that was the original fall of the angels, or the fall of the Watchers, that we get a very brief glimpse of that in Genesis chapter 6, and then it's expanded much further in the book of Enoch.
Well, in your perspective, essentially, in theory too, actually, if the fallen angels or the Watchers were to propagate with the human women, would there still be offspring on the planet today, or would we all be considered offspring? In your perspective, your point of view?
That's a good question, yeah.
Yeah, that is a very good question. To be perfectly honest, I don't know. I mean, you would think so. However, according to the ancient text, what brought about the deluge was in an attempt to eradicate all of this interbreeding. So whenever you look around the world, you find all sorts of stories about a great flood. Now, whether or not it actually covered every single part of the earth, that's up for debate. But
so in the Hebrew text, that's actually stated as it was a curse, correct?
Well, yeah, essentially in Genesis chapter 6, it briefly talks about the fall of the angels, and then the very next part starts talking about how wickedness and evil would spread among the land and how humanity had become so corrupted. Now, if you knew more about the book of Enoch, then the readers at that time knew this story and knew what it was talking about, but for a lot of modern people, if they're not familiar with that story, then they don't know it, and so it just goes into that saying everyone became corrupted, and then we get the story about how God is going to send the great flood, and so Noah's told to build the ark.
Well,
and so not everyone...
I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, and one of them has an extra yod letter, which only comes from an Aramaic root. And so whenever you study the Aramaic root, that implies that it meant giant. So that's why we try to stick more with that approach than just saying that they were one and the same as the Watchers or the Fallen Ones. But it could simply be a title that the children inherited from their parents. So there isn't really a whole lot of information about it in the text specifically referring to the Nephilim as a title. So since there isn't a whole lot, I just try to stick with what the scholars know right now.
Yes.
Now, Melchizedek, you had a question about the Anunnaki. As far as in the ancient... Go ahead.
I was just going to say, to clarify for the listeners out there, because we kind of do a show that's in layman's terms, so whenever we talk about something, we'll kind of explain it just a little bit so everybody can understand what we're talking about.
Sure. Now, the Anunnaki, that comes from the ancient Sumerian and Mesopotamian texts. That's what they used to refer to their ancient gods. And the best scholarly definition of that meant princely offspring. Now, if you get into the research of somebody like Zecharia Sitchin, he tries to say that it meant those who from heaven to earth came. But we can get into this later on. I usually don't try to get into the bashing other authors, but Zecharia Sitchin is one that usually does come up since he's so well known regarding this material. And
he has done a lot of research too into the area, and unless somebody lived during that time, it's hard for anybody to say who's right,
Well, yeah, I suppose, but at the same time, his own books prove that he doesn't know the ancient languages that he claims to know. So if you study what the scholars put forth and then compare it, I actually have a section in my book where I'm showing, the very word that Sitchin is talking about that he says isn't in the line that he reproduces in the text is there if you know what you're looking for.
Is that is that the word Anakim?
No, that's actually he was referring to a line of text referring to the Watchers, and he reproduces. I think it's in the book Stairway to Heaven, and he reproduces the line of text because he shows it, and it's in Aramaic, although he refers to it as Hebrew. But it's actually Aramaic if you know the difference. And essentially he says that the Watchers and the Nephilim are the same, but he says nowhere in this line does it say Watchers. And if you actually look at the line he reproduces in his own book, if you know what the word Watchers looks like in Aramaic, it's right there in the middle of it. So he's trying to
the ones we might know of as the creators of the human species, or the ones who manipulated our DNA to create us. So maybe you can expand on that, and we can start tying everything else in through these supposed creators of ours.
Sure. Well, I know a lot of your listeners are probably familiar with the material by now because I noticed some of your recent guests. And what we're told in a lot of the ancient texts were that there were these beings known as angels or gods that came from the heavenly realms, and they essentially did something. They interacted with the human race. Now, whether or not they actually did any genetic manipulation or anything, that's just speculation, so we're not really sure about that. But at the very least, what the ancient texts do tell us is that they gave humanity and civilization a jump start so that they passed down knowledge and other information that gave humans power. And unfortunately, some of this knowledge and power wasn't things that we were meant to know at the time, and so a lot of these angels or gods were punished for their deeds, and they were known as the Watchers.
So is there anything to differentiate the Watchers from the Nephilim?
Well, if you go with the more scholarly basis on this, generally they would say that the Nephilim were actually the hybrid offspring, the union between the Watchers, which were angels, and human women.
Yeah.
And
speaking about
now,
the Titans and the Giants in the Old Testament. Of
yeah,
the Bible,
yeah, you get the same kind of myths all around the world, whether you're talking about the Titans or. Sure. Now, I do speculate, though, since Nephilim, it does partially have a Hebrew root. If you study the etymology of the word, it can mean fallen ones, but it's also based on an Aramaic root, and Hebrew and Aramaic were very closely related in the ancient world. And
for the listeners out there, could you maybe set some differences or similarities between the Anunnaki and the Nephilim? Are there any differences?
Sure.
Are there any similarities?
Sure, I can get into that. Just to finish up the thought about the Nephilim, like it means fallen ones if you take the Hebrew approach, but if you look at the Aramaic root, it also meant giants. So that's why I try to stick with the scholarly approach that it was referring to the offspring.
What's the exact root word for that?
Nephal.
In the Hebrew? Nephal.
Yeah, in the Hebrew. Now,
and that's Nephal?
Yeah, that would be the transliteration into English.
Okay.
Now, the scholar Michael Heiser has pointed out that there are two spellings of Nephilim in the Old Testament. I mean, I don't have any problem with the idea of the
we have a lot of Sitchinites listening, so of course.
I'm sure.
Not only that, but we kind of stay away from knocking other authors because we know a lot of authors and we know a lot. We respect everybody's ideas and the way their perspectives and stuff, but you know. I got a real interesting question for you later on whenever we get past this point right here and get into the
I just wanted to get off the Sitchin thing, maybe for him to close it off on his perspective on basically what people can look for and what they shouldn't be looking at out of Sitchin's work, basically.
Well, like I said, I don't have any real problem with the idea of the ancient gods being from another planet. It's just whenever you actually go back and look at the ancient text and you compare what Zecharia Sitchin is saying, it doesn't actually match. He feels that he can reinterpret the meanings of a lot of the words, and so the difference I tried to do with mine was go back and look at what the scholars tell us the words mean and try to put that into my current theories and everything and see if they fit. And what I found was that the modern or even the older scholars' translations and understandings of the words fit more in line with my theories than Zecharia Sitchin's, and I think it bridges a whole lot of gaps in what we know about the paranormal and everything. So, again, I'm not trying to bash other authors. I mean, I don't want to come off that way. That's not really, my thing. But I do feel it is a responsibility for other people. I mean, if they're going to get into this, just double check other sources. Don't take any one author's word as the ultimate source. I want everyone feel free to question me, to double check my work if you have questions or problems with it. Research it. If you find something wrong, let me know.
Exactly. Yeah, that's basically the point I wanted to get out, so the listeners can make their own discernment and basically try to figure out what are the truths within Sitchin's work and what are the faults.
Yeah, like I said, it's been several years since I read a lot of it, so I can't really think of any specific points that I can recall, unless you know something.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. We since it tied, like you mentioned before, it ties so much into his early works. Just to close his whole position off in this conversation, but let's maybe get back into the fallen angels, because I noticed your book contains a lot of work on the fallen angels. So maybe you can explain your perspective of the fallen angels.
Sure. Well, basically, a lot of